Hola, Econ peeps. Time for Module 8. All right, moving right along here. If I can find my mouse. There it is. All right, so we're going to talk about the dominant model for the remainder of the course. It's aggregate demand, aggregate supply. And at the macro level, this kind of does a little bit of everything for us. And it's a really important model. It's built, it kind of builds on our understanding of supply and demand. Only throws in that word aggregate. And aggregate means to add everything up, to sum it up, to put it all together. And so this is, aggregate demand would be the demand for everything. And aggregate supply is the supply of everything. Now, can we really capture all of that? No, this is not necessarily, but this is a useful modeling tool that captures what happens in the economy given our somewhat limited policy-making abilities. Again, ceteris paribus. I mean, nothing else is changing. We can change government spending and use this model to describe what would happen in the economy, assuming nothing else changed. Obviously, other things change, but you'll see how useful this is, I think. And you tell me if I'm wrong. Always open to hearing from you. I don't get a lot of emails from y'all. I'm assuming that's a good thing. You know, no news is good news. But I'm certainly available. I'm certainly here and willing to help to whatever extent I can. If you have emailed me and I haven't responded, I certainly apologize. I have a lot of students, and this is my first year at Ranger and my first year being an adjunct at Tarleton State, and I'm teaching math and economics, and so it's entirely possible that maybe an email or two has slipped through the cracks. And if that's the case, please accept my sincere apologies. I'm always wanting to be responsive to my students, so if I have not been and failed in any way in that, please don't hesitate to let me know so I can apologize to you personally and see if we can't maybe resolve whatever the issue was with you. Okay? All right. So back to aggregate supply, aggregate demand, or aggregate demand, aggregate supply. I don't think it matters, but this is a model that shows what determines real output as opposed to nominal. We're talking about real, and the aggregate price level. So it's very similar to what we dealt with supply and demand. Only now the vertical axis is not price of a good, it's the price level. In other words, kind of generally where the price of everything's at. Is it going up? Is it going down? Obviously, because prices vary widely from one good to the next, from one service to the next, you can't capture a single price that summarizes all of that. That's not what we're talking about here. And instead of on the horizontal axis, which was the quantity, now we're going to do real output, quantity of everything that we produce in the economy, right? And so one of the reasons I think it's fair to say economists really like this model is because two of our big macroeconomic indicators, inflation, changes to the price level, and output and economic growth, changes to output, those are directly a part of this model. Similarly, the third big economic indicator that we've spoken of, unemployment, is at least implicitly a part of this because remember, it moves in the opposite direction of output. If output rises, unemployment's coming down. And if output falls, unemployment's going up. And so if you're looking on here, if we're tracking real output, then you can see what will happen to unemployment generally. Oftentimes these are lagging indicators. It doesn't happen immediately, but eventually they're going to show up. So we can talk about this. All right. So this helps us get an idea of what's happening with real output as well as the price level, i.e. inflation. And it's the interaction between total spending on domestic goods and services, in other words, aggregate demand, and total production by business, in other words, aggregate supply. All right. So here's our vocabulary for this section, all right, that we're going to be using a lot of. So aggregate demand is the amount of total spending on all goods and services in the economy. And remember, when we add that, because we're using real output as our basis for aggregate demand, we're talking about the value of the amount of total spending on finished goods and services, right? Aggregate supply is the total quantity of output or real GDP firms will produce and sell. The curve for both the aggregate demand and aggregate supply, just a sort of graphical representation of where the economy is. And then there's a couple of important effects, and these primarily relate to aggregate demand. In other words, why, remember that demand curve is downward sloping. There's an inverse relationship in supply and demand model between price and quantity demanded, right? The law of demand. And that downward sloping demand curve sort of formally codifies, if you will, this law of demand. So now we've got a situation where this aggregate demand curve is likewise downward sloping, and what you're saying is there's an inverse relationship between the price level, inflation, and output. Okay? And there's an element of truth to this. So, as we will see, there can very much be a relationship between those two. I mean, there is, but sometimes it can be offset because, again, ceteris paribus isn't the real thing. We will be changing. The reality is, in the economy, multiple variables change all simultaneously and at different times, and has an effect on what we do over here. So, bear with me. This will make a little bit more sense. So, the question becomes, why is there an inverse relationship? But we don't have a law of aggregate demand. Why is there an inverse relationship between the price level and output? Well, there's a couple of good reasons. They list two of them here. There's really another one. So one's called the foreign price effect, right? So what happens is if prices rise in the United States, but not in other countries, then our stuff just got relatively more expensive compared to their stuff. Okay? So naturally, foreign consumers are going to prefer to buy more of their less expensive domestically produced goods than our more expensive U.S. produced goods. Likewise, the U.S., us as consumers, we're going to want to buy some of that less expensive foreign stuff. And we're going to buy a little less of our domestically produced stuff because it got more expensive. And remember, output, four components of output: consumer spending, business spending, government spending, and net exports, X minus M. All right, E before I. So remember, if that's the case, so what that means is our spending on exports, our spending on imports just went up. We're buying more of the cheaper foreign stuff, all right, and less of our more expensive domestically produced stuff. So exports is coming down, imports is going up. You subtract a larger number from a smaller number, guess what? That becomes an even bigger trade deficit for us. That becomes a drag. So as prices rise, as that price level, as we move up that vertical axis on the price level, we are naturally going to be shifting output down. Output is going to be declining as a result of foreign purchases effect, ceteris paribus. The interest rate effect. Okay, so one of the things we're going to talk about later, I think this book does a fairly good job of capturing how interest rates. I may have mentioned this before, but there are really two models that we use to capture interest rates. One of them is called the loanable funds model, and it's just supply and demand for loanable funds, funds that banks have available to loan out. That's all right? And where those two, supply of loanable funds and demand of loanable funds, where those two intersect, that's we call that the equilibrium interest rate. Okay, and then there's this one called the liquidity model for interest rates, right? And that one is the one where, for reasons beyond the scope of this class, the money supply curve is vertical. And so you have the demand curve that's coming, that's intersecting that supply curve, downward sloping through it. Well, and where those two intersect, that's your equilibrium interest rate. So, if the demand for money goes up, if goods get more expensive, let me put it this way. So remember that price level. If goods get more expensive, we're going to demand more money to pay for the more expensive stuff. The value of the currency is going to be less, so it's going to take more of it to buy the same stuff. That means the demand for money is going to increase. That's a rightward shift of my money demand curve. That's going to be intersecting my vertical supply curve at a higher point, meaning the interest rates just went up. That's going to lead to, remember, we use interest rates to borrow money. So when you have this situation where interest rates go up, it costs more money to borrow money. That means primarily businesses, but consumers too will be spending less money. All right, so keep this in mind as we work through this. We'll talk more about this, okay? I think we'll cover this in a little bit more detail. But the foreign price effect, when our stuff gets more expensive, we buy less of our stuff, foreign consumers buy less of our stuff, and that means spending on exports is going to fall, spending on imports is going to rise, and X minus M, net exports, is going to increase, but it's a negative number in our case, and so it's hurting us. I guess technically it decreases. The negative number is getting larger in our case because we were in a trade deficit, but you get the idea. And then with this interest rate effect, says that as prices rise, we're going to demand more money, causing interest rates to rise, and businesses will spend less money because it costs more to borrow money now. Likewise, if prices fall, interest rates are going to fall. There's less demand for money, so interest rates will fall, and that makes spending more viable. So as you move up this price, as you move from zero to up the price level, your output is falling and falling because business are spending less and less as interest rates rise, as increasing demand for money. Okay, those are the two big effects. There's another one called the called the wealth effect. It's down here on the bottom. Not sure why they separated it, but we'll talk about that one in a moment. All right. Some more of the verbiage we'll use. Long run. So there's a period of time. There's an idea out there called sticky price theory that says in the short run, prices are sticky. There's an element of truth to this, not universally across every single good or service, but some people are a little reluctant. Some businesses are reluctant to change their prices. If you own a restaurant, you know what I mean. You don't want to have to change your prices. That means you've got to reprint all your menus. There is a cost associated with you increasing your prices. In fact, we call that a menu cost. We're not that clever. So in the short run, most of these things are fixed and locked in, and you're not going to be changing prices and wages all that much. But in the long run, all of those things are flexible. All of those things are flexible. So the long run is that period of time when we finally reach the point where all wages and prices are fully flexible. Everything is changed. It can be changed. All right. The short run, they're a little sticky at first, but as we move through the time horizon, they become less sticky. How's that? All right. Then there's something called a long-run aggregate supply curve. Now, this model first created, there was no such thing. We've had to add it, partly because of what we learned, especially through the 70s. But nonetheless, long-run aggregate supply curve is a vertical line, and it represents potential GDP. Do you remember the business cycle, that trend line in the business cycle? That's what the long-run aggregate supply really is, right? And it shows that there really is, in the long run, no relationship between the price level and output. In the long run, that relationship doesn't exist the same way it does in the short run. Very important distinction. It's also important to understand, and we'll see the model, this long-run aggregate supply curve that's perfectly vertical, to the extent that it intersects my aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve in the same place that those two are intersecting, we call that long-run equilibrium. That's where we want to be. That's when inflation is going to be less than 2%. Output's going to be right at 3%. Unemployment's going to be around the full employment level, right about 4 or 5%. That's where we want to be. But just like that business cycle snakes around that trend line, that potential GDP, guess what? The intersection of short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand is kind of moving back and forth with the long-run aggregate supply. So where those two intersect, that's called short-run equilibrium. And it just oscillates back and forth, just like that business cycle is going back and up and down. Well, this is going back and forth. Inflationary, recessionary, inflationary, recessionary. This will make sense. Bear with me, okay? So that's long-run aggregate supply. Potential GDP, again, we talked about that, I think, in terms of the business cycle. This is the maximum quantity that an economy can produce given full employment. And that's what we call that. We call it full employment output, where at long-run equilibrium is also known as full employment output. Okay? That's a really important point. I mentioned that when we were talking about the employment level. We were doing that module with employment. Short run, again, period of time during which wages and some prices are sticky. Changes in demand not going to necessarily have an immediate effect on those prices, certainly not on those wages. Then the short-run aggregate supply curve, which is really what we're dealing with, aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, long-run aggregate supply. Those are our three. We want them all three to intersect the same place. That's full employment output. That's where we want to be. That's long-run equilibrium. Short-run equilibrium is where just the short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand intersect. And if that's different than where the long-run aggregate supply is, you're going to have a gap between that intersection and the long-run aggregate supply curve. Okay? And that gap has a name, depending on where the gap is. Is it in front of it or behind it? Okay? And again, it's upward sloping like the regular supply curve because it shows that positive relationship between the aggregate price level and aggregate output, right? Assuming inputs prices are fixed, ceteris paribus again, right? Then there's the wealth effect. I guess because this is alphabetized, that's why it didn't. And I guess these two were close enough in the alphabet that they just happen to be next to one another. But wealth effect is another one of those explanations for why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping, right? It says that as price levels increase, your savings increase in purchasing power. You have as the price level increases, it's like your purchasing power is declining. You don't have as much. But when prices fall, you can buy more stuff without, it's like you've gotten wealthier or something. That's why we call it the wealth effect. It's this idea that as prices rise, it takes more of your money to buy stuff, so it's like you got poorer. And as prices fall, it takes less of your money to buy that stuff. It's almost like you got richer. All right. So there's the short-run aggregate supply curve. Potential GDP would be your long-run aggregate supply curve, and they're intersecting at a price level of 105 with real output of 9,600. That's probably 9.5 trillion, but it doesn't specify. That's okay. So the horizontal axis of the diagram shows output. We often will, when I draw these, I use Y. This is very common nomenclature used in economics. The letter Y is used to represent real output on that, and then just a capital P for price level. That's how I usually do it. That's why you'll notice when I was doing my supply and demand, I always did a lowercase p, kind of flared out a little bit to show a lowercase p. That's why. And I always did a lowercase q because sometimes they'll use capital Q for output in this model. I use Y, but you get the idea. Okay. Yeah, I don't want to get, obviously, especially aggregate supply, aggregate demand, these are not linear by any stretch of the imagination. But I don't want to get I don't want to wander too far off the beaten path here to talk about, how it's flat and then it slowly starts going out. But here's what's happening. So the reason why we really have three aggregate supply curves, we have a short-run aggregate supply curve because in the short run, nothing is really changing, right? They're not really responding to changes in demand. Prices aren't changing, wages aren't changing. But as time goes on, slowly but surely, that price is going to start to change, and that supply curve is going to start bending upward. Then you have, it's almost horizontal. We call that the immediate short-run aggregate supply curve. I won't be using that one much, okay? And then as it starts to come up, we call that the short-run aggregate supply curve. As it starts to bend, as it starts to go up, until it reaches completely vertical, and that's the long-run aggregate supply curve. So you have immediate short-run, horizontal, short-run aggregate supply curve, diagonal, at various angles from 0 to 90, and once it reaches 90, it's long-run aggregate supply curve. And it's, over time, it's constantly doing that. Now, of course, the economy's always moving, so where it was, it's not like we wait until see where it ends up 3 months from now or something like that, right? It's always changing in somewhere in this process and different for everything. So, all right. Again, in the long run, everything's flexible, and because of that, our resources will be fully employed, and output and potential will be equal. Doesn't matter what the price level is. All right, so here's the aggregate demand curve, downward sloping, to denote that inverse relationship that's caused by the interest rate effect, the foreign purchases effect, the wealth effect. Those are the big three causes of this downward sloping aggregate demand curve, the three big causes of this inverse relationship between the price level and real output. Okay? All right. So here's more information about why it's downward sloping, that wealth effect, right? As the price level increases, your purchasing power decreases. It's going to take more money to buy the same stuff. It's like you just got poorer. All right. So, and because of that, you're going to spend less money. You don't have it because it takes more of what you do have to buy the things that you are buying. So as prices rise, you're going to be moving, the output's going to be falling. At least consumer spending will be falling. Interest rate effect primarily affects businesses, some consumers as well. But again, as prices rise, the increasing demand for money is going to cause interest rates to rise in the liquidity model. And so that is going to ultimately lead to less business spending because it's going to cost more to borrow money. Also true of consumer spending. Weird quirk of how we calculate GDP. even though consumers buy homes, we don't consider the home purchase to be part of consumer spending. It's part of business spending. I'm not sure exactly why they make a big deal out of this, and some textbooks really focus on this more than others. I don't think ours did at all. But generally speaking, buying a house is considered business spending, not consumer spending. That's why when I talk about interest rates, I primarily say it's going to affect business spending. Okay? All right. So there's that interest rate. Prices rise. We need more money to buy stuff because it's taking more money to buy stuff because we've lost purchasing power. And that's going to create more demand for money, which is going to cause interest rates to rise, which is going to make borrowing more expensive. And so less borrowing means less business spending. Okay? So as prices rise, output's going to start falling, ceteris paribus. Foreign price effect. So this is showing the effect of 3 of the 4 components of GDP: consumer spending, business spending, and net exports. Government spending is a little bit different because it doesn't really respond to, well, much of anything that we wish it would. We'll talk about that in detail. I guess it does. It depends on who you are, I suppose, whether you agree with them spending money on this or spending money on that. But generally speaking, their decisions about spending has less to do with the state of the economy and more to do with the state of their political careers. Sorry. I think that's a fairly accurate statement. But again, email me if you disagree. Foreign price effect here for net exports. Again, as prices rise, our goods get more expensive to foreign and domestic consumers. We buy less of ours, more of theirs. Exports is coming down because they're buying less of our stuff, so they don't want as much of ours, so exports is coming down. We're buying more of theirs, so the imports is going up. A smaller X subtracting a larger M means we're going to be subtracting an even larger number from our output calculation. All right, that's going to cause your net exports to fall. In our case, it's going to become a larger negative number. I know that's weird. All right, and there's their intersection. All right, so a good way to draw this. And again, being able to visualize this is going to help you. Now, I'm going to give you what I think is a pretty good resource, a tool to do it. Do you remember when we talked about supply and demand? And the things that cause the demand curve to shift, the things that cause the supply curve to shift, and I said, remember this: as goes demand, so goes price and quantity. Well, guess what? Now, instead of things that cause the non-price determinants of supply and demand, well, how about this? How about there are 3 different types of policy. Well, I shouldn't say that. There's 2 types of policy. There's fiscal policy and monetary policy. All right. There is a third one we'll get to at the end of the year. It deals with foreign stuff. But right now we'll focus on fiscal and monetary certainly the next part of the early part of the next year. That's going to be our big focus, and how those policies change aggregate demand specifically. Rarely is it going to affect aggregate supply. I wish it would, and when we have the tools there, I will explain what I mean by that. But right now, our policy tools are really limited, only affecting aggregate demand. Okay, and so we're going to be talking about how those policies, what effect will it have on the economy, ceteris paribus, right? And what we mean is, if the government increases taxes, that's going to decrease aggregate demand. As goes aggregate demand, so goes the price level and output. And because we don't really mess with the supply curve too much, you don't have to really know that one. You can always figure it out from drawing. But as goes aggregate demand, so goes the price level and output. And unemployment moves in the opposite direction of output. So I can tell you what happens to all 3 of our big macroeconomic indicators just by doing that with this one model. That's what's pretty powerful stuff. A lot of people don't like it. They don't believe it exists. There's no such thing. I'll explain why I think that's bunk in a later post when we have more of this tool that I can show you how I used it, for example, to predict the current state of the economy back in May of 2020. I did. And it was very simple. Just use this. God knows I'm no genius. Ask my brothers and my son. All right. So there's good instructions for kind of how to do that. All right. The only thing, and that AS that it's got there, you really want to add an SR in front of it. Short run aggregate supply curve. That's the main one we're going to focus, and then we'll put another one down the middle, long run aggregate supply curve. Okay? Considering the schedule below, what is the equilibrium price level? Well, it's at 100. Okay, it's at 100 at 13 million. That's the amount of output demanded, and that's the or trillion, 13 trillion. That's the output supply. Okay. Now, what are some of the things that are going to affect the ag demand curve? Well, these are sometimes this happens due to effect of policy making, right? So a demand shock. We talked about this, I think. A hurricane hits. Suddenly, there's going to be a huge spike in demand for bottled water, right? Sometimes there's a positive supply shock. Those are pretty rare, or demand shock. Usually, if it's a shock, it's bad. Okay, but a negative demand shock would shift the ag demand curve leftward, and that means more towards zero. So if that's a decrease, if ag demand is decreasing, price level and output are decreasing. Okay. Surely you can surmise what business confidence and consumer confidence are. I hope. All right. And yes, you can affect supply shocks at the aggregate level. So this is as good a time as any to kind of give you some idea of what I'm talking about here and how effective this model can be and why I think it's a little short-sighted to just dismiss it out of hand. I'm not saying it's the end-all be-all of economics, but it's certainly enough to suggest that we ought to hold on to it and not get rid of it just yet. I think there's some pretty good uses for it. Okay? So let me draw where the economy was in, let's say, late 2019, early 2020 maybe. All right, so there's my short run. Let me go ahead and make this big. My TV. There you go. All right, that is my basic ASAD model right there. All right, I'm going to add one other thing. Notice I put Y down there. That's my output, aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply. Now I'm going to put a long run aggregate supply right down the middle. And I'm going to label about where that would intersect that horizontal axis, my output axis, Y sub F for full employment output level. That's a common vernacular, common nomenclature in labeling these kinds of graphs. Y sub F. All right? So let's talk about what happened in 2020. This little bug started going around. People started getting infected. We thought it was going to be a lot worse. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. They thought it was going to be a lot worse than it ended up being. I'll assume they didn't know that it wasn't going to be as bad. Okay? There's lots of conspiracy theories and craziness out there, but let's give them the benefit of the doubt for the purpose of our class at least, right? Nonetheless, they made the decision that I think was catastrophically moronic. I think it was a terrible idea. You can't. The global economy is not a wind-up toy that you can stop and start on a whim. All right? And when they turned off the economy, when everybody had to go home, when everything was shut down, you basically created what I call an aggregate supply shock. That causes your aggregate supply curves to lurch backwards. Let me draw that for you. I'll use a different color so it'll stand out, okay? Label short run aggregate supply curve 1. All right, and I'm also going to show you about where the price level was. All right, so here's my full model. This was, we'll say this was about mid to late 2019. That's about where we were. We were at full employment output. The economy was in good shape. Everything was fine. Relatively speaking. Not for everybody. It will never be fine for everybody, I promise you. One thing I've figured out in my life is no matter what I do, I cannot be all things to all people at all times. Neither can our economy. Right? Somebody's going to be disappointed in my class no matter what I do. Somebody's going to be disappointed in the economy no matter how good it is. Maybe it's not always as good for you. All right. So we shut down the global economy. Let's just stick with the American economy. They shut down the U.S. economy, causing a backward sort of lurch of my aggregate supply curve. You see that? All right. So this means that now it is intersecting my aggregate demand curve at a higher point, causing prices to rise, as I will show you, and output to fall. See what happened there? Prices went up, output went down. This is a really, 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 really bad thing. Really bad thing. It has a name. So now we've got our economy that's shrinking, or at best not growing. In other words, it's stagnant, and we have higher prices. Right? Inflation. We call that stagflation. Stagnant economy with inflation. This is the worst of both worlds, isn't it? Remember what I told you, unemployment moves in the opposite direction. So when you have stagflation, let me get this centered here a little bit better. You have a situation, there we go. You have a situation where the economy is shrinking, so you have higher unemployment, and prices are going up. Really hard to afford things when you don't have a job. Right? So, we start slowly opening the economy back up. Not unreasonably. At this point, the economy had shrank on an annualized basis of like 30%, meaning almost 2 to 3% a year, a month in the time span that we were closed down from roughly March to June, July, August. We began opening some things up, but not everything. But slowly but surely, as things started opening back up, we find out the economy had contracted by historic Depression-era levels. Scared, reasonably scared, they made the decision to, let me pause here real quick. I'll remind you that the decision to shut down the economy was not made by Joe Biden. It was made by President Trump. I think that's an important point to make. Okay? I don't want anybody to think I'm being politically biased here against the current sitting president, because there's plenty of blame to go around, which is always true in politics, in case you wonder. But anyway, so with the economy having contracted to near Depression-era levels, and inflation, prices rising, we got stagflation in the economy. The decision was, you have one of two choices. You can either try to increase output, or the only way you're going to be, I shouldn't say that, you can either increase output to close your recessionary gap, or you can decrease output to close your inflationary gap. Well, and you'll see how you do this with the policies, how you can do this. We're doing it right now, right? With what the choices the Fed's making. So here's what I'm trying to tell you. The decision was made to grow the economy to close the recessionary gap. So we would call this gap that opened between where we were in full employment output here, and now it's hard going backwards here. We're right here, right? So with this red dot, from that black dot that we were, put a black dot on there so you can see that. All right? Right there. That's what we're talking about. All right? So we moved from that black dot to the red dot, where the second short run average supply curve is intersecting aggregate demand. That's the red dot. All right? So that's called a recessionary gap. We have a recessionary gap. We have it coupled with higher prices, which we don't usually have. This is what happens when you have an aggregate supply shock. So we decided to try to grow our way out of that recessionary gap. Not unreasonable given how bad the economy had declined during that time frame. Not surprisingly, right? So they started sending money to people, which is like the worst way to stimulate an economy. As far as economic policy, it was, again, not the smartest way to do it, in my opinion. Send me an email if you disagree. So doing so, this means consumers have a lot more money to spend. Well, remember, my output is C plus I plus G plus NX. Right? So if you increase consumer spending, you increase output. And for reasons we'll talk about later, you actually increase output by even more. It's called the multiplier effect. We'll talk about that. But nonetheless, So basically, that shifts the entire demand curve way to the right. Let's draw that. All right, now you will notice, okay, that I have basically we are now back at long run equilibrium. But look at the price level; it's gone much higher. We've closed that recessionary gap that developed. Where is it? Right down here? We've closed this, right here. We closed this recessionary gap, right? We moved it back over here, but inflation is even worse. So if you're wondering why we have been dealing with this inflation, this is why. This is one of the reasons why. And this was the model I used to predict this back in May of 2020. Okay? I wrote it down. I'll show it to you one day. So I'm not making that up. But the situation has gotten even worse since then. We will talk about that on another day for another reason. We'll get there. Okay? I'm gonna try to remember to save this for that day. Because this was phase 1 and 2. There's going to be a third one. May get to it before the end of this one, but I know we'll get to it here within the next lecture or 2 or 5. All right, so that was a negative supply shock, an adverse aggregate supply shock, right? A leftward shift. It was temporary, so I didn't need to shift the whole long run aggregate supply curve. It wasn't something that lingered too long. We didn't leave it shut down that long, and we immediately started growing it back to keep that long run aggregate supply curve from shrinking, from showing too much negative economic growth over the course of any length of time. There's stagflation. This is an economy that's experiencing stagnant growth with high inflation. Okay? All right. I didn't know they put these questions in there. This is the first I've seen them. When an economy's output increases and the price level increases, the blank curve is shifted to the blank. Well, the fact that it is telling you that both output and price level increased, as goes aggregate demand, so goes price level, so goes quantity or output. So the fact that they both increase means aggregate demand shifted to the right. Answer C. All right. The most important factor shifting the aggregate supply curve is productivity growth. I think I've told you this before. We don't have any good economic indicators. If I'm being honest with you, it's not that they're bad economic indicators. They just don't tell us where the economy's going. Most of our indicators are what we call lagging indicators. They tell us where the economy's been. That can be useful. Don't get me wrong. It's nice to know, wow, we're really bad last month. That's good to know. But I think most people would be a heck of a lot happier knowing it's going to be good next month. We just don't have that. But there's one really good, fairly good harbinger of things to come, if you will, and that's productivity growth. Monitor productivity. That gives you a good idea of whether the economy is going to be growing much. Okay? All right? And you remember we talked about productivity in that special lecture, right? About the cost of living. That's one of the reasons why we've been able to bring prices down in a very meaningful way. It may not seem like it, but it has. At least in the data that I presented. I haven't heard back from anybody yet about that. We'll see if anybody balks at my conclusions. But nonetheless, we saw that when you have good productivity growth, the economy grows in such a way that it allows people to buy more stuff with the same amount of money. Or in real terms, in nominal terms, their wages go up. But in real terms, hadn't gone up as much as most people would like it to have. But you can still buy more stuff because in very real terms, it doesn't take as much time and effort to make as much money as it used to. Anyway, productivity grows so that the quantity of labor can produce more output, as I was saying, and the real growth in GDP per capita, remember that's GDP per person. You just take your total output and divide it by the number of people, by your population, and that gives you GDP per capita. Real growth in GDP per capita in an advanced economy like the U.S. has averaged about 2 to 3% per year. Okay? Productivity growth has been faster during certain extended periods like the 60s and the late 90s through the early 2000s, and then slower during periods like the 70s, and like we're probably going to be experiencing much of this decade and maybe beyond. Depends on what's happened in other areas. We'll talk about that. That's the other part of this. All right. And y'all let me know if that doesn't make sense, because I don't have the luxury of feedback and people going, I don't understand, and throwing rotten tomatoes at me in class. I don't have that luxury here because we're just online. I'm just making a video talking to myself, which is a little creepy and weird. But I know you're going to watch this at some point. Y'all let me know if that doesn't make sense. I'll find some other way to explain to you. I'll schedule Zoom times and try to get as many of you to show up as possible. And we'll all talk together about this. You let me know if that's something you want. We can do that. Remember, I have Zoom office hours. You are free to pop in anytime between 6 and 7:20 on Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. Ask anything you want. I'm happy to help. Okay? And I haven't heard from anybody. Nobody showed up office hours yet. I'm starting to feel unwanted. It's all good. If you need me, I'm there. If you don't, I'm still there. All right? Yeah, so productivity in the late 90s, early 2000s was driven by, I think I've talked about this before, we have these two paradigm-shifting technologies, two really big, important technologies, right? They were so important, and they both merged. They both merged. That's redundant. They merged. They came together. I'm talking about communications and computers. They came together, and now we have the internet. And it revolutionized, it made everything more productive. Communication was faster. Everything made things easier to automate. Accounting was quicker and more efficient. All of those things led to higher productivity levels, which led to growth. Okay? Business cycle, again. This is just another way to understand the business cycle. I talked about that earlier. Recession occurs as a result of a negative demand or supply shock. It's almost always going to be demand. In fact, they're being a little fast and loose here. Up until the 70s, there was no consideration of it even being possible for the aggregate supply curve to move backwards. Never was thought to be possible. When that happened in the 70s, it threw a major wrench in economic theory and the thinking of the day. You ended up with a whole bunch of new theories. Monetarism really became a little bit more popular as a result of it. There were a whole bunch of other sort of crazy real growth theories and business cycle theories and all kinds of stuff become out and really trying to take over Keynesian. It did. Keynesian lived and became what we call neo-Keynesianism, if you will. This may not make sense to y'all because you don't understand the people involved in all this, but it's just a name for the type of economic theory that we teach usually. Some of you may have heard of Keynesianism. It's named after an English economist by the name of John Maynard Keynes. Most of that Keynesianistic stuff has survived and even thrived. And this average supply, aggregate demand model is based on Keynesian. That's one of the reasons why they want to get rid of it. They don't like it and don't believe it's real because it's Keynesian. But it can accurately predict what's going on. It's effective. And again, we'll show you some more here when we start talking more about what happened in the 70s and how that's repeating itself now. All right. So we've kind of talked about all this. I don't want to beat the dead horse here too much. And here is so this right here, where this dot is, and this is where you want to be, right? You want to be here. Or I guess really you want to be here. You want to be at least you want to be somewhere between these two, where they're intersecting the long-run average supply curve, preferably here with lower prices. All right, but that would mean the aggregate demand curve needs to be back. So what's happened here is we have what we call this is a recessionary gap between the long-run equilibrium and when short-run equilibrium is behind your long-run average supply curve, you have a recessionary gap. Output is below. Output is less than, here's zero over here. Here's where we want to be. This is full employment output here, and where we're current output level is actually below that. So we have a recessionary gap. Then here we have what we call an inflationary gap. Okay, this is notice that as we move from here to here, prices went up. And anytime that you end up with short-run equilibrium out in front of long-run average supply curve, moving away from zero, you have a faster growing economy. I think one of the slides in one of the previous lectures talked about an economy that overheated. That's what we're talking about. That's an overheated economy. It's going to live too fast for its britches. It needs to slow down. Just take it easy. So says Keynesian economics. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that that's how we teach it. And that's Keynesian's influence, to be sure. Some people think it is crazy to slow down the economy. Well, if it's going well, why don't you join it instead of try to slow it down? Yeah, well, it's a valid point in my opinion. Nonetheless. All right. So this was just a quick introduction to the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. Okay. Please remember this stuff. This is really important. If for no other reason, because it's what's happening right now. There's one more piece of this that's making prices go up even higher and repeating this inflationary pressures. All right, and what's going on in Russia and Ukraine and oil and all that stuff, and the shift towards renewables and all that. That's causing some of these problems, adding to more inflationary pressure. So here's a quick review. Be sure to go through that if you need it. Okay, cannot hurt. It's all good stuff. Don't hesitate to ask me any questions that you have. Again, remember my office hours, 6 to 7:20. If you need the link, it's on the syllabus, which is in the course page. You can easily find it. I'm right there. Don't hesitate to come and join me. Have a conversation. All right. I don't want you to feel like you're on your own and you can't get any help. I know this has to feel awkward, especially if you're a high school student. This got to feel a little weird. Maybe not, because you went through 2 years of it thanks to the pandemic. But nonetheless, don't feel like you can't reach out and get help. But you don't have an instructor, because you do. I'm right here. My name is Jack, Dr. Reynolds for you. But nonetheless, feel free to call me. Zoom me. How's that? And I can always set up a different time. It doesn't have to be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, 6 to 7:20. If you needed a different time, let me know, and I'll see what my availability is. I may be in class, or I do have a family. I've got a little 9-year-old boy who wants to see his daddy. So, but nonetheless, folks, best of luck. Have a great week, and we will be back here for Module 9, and that's when we're going to talk about Keynesian and neoclassical economics, and you'll learn more about all the stuff that most of you probably wish I'd shut up about. No chance. All right. And then we'll come back the one after that and talk about the income expenditure model, and then that will wrap up this unit. Okay? And then when we come back after the Unit 2 test, that's when we start talking about fiscal policy and monetary policy. And we can't talk about monetary policy without talking about money and banking. And then with policy applications of that. Just like we have policy applications in supply and demand, we're going to have policy applications in aggregate supply, aggregate demand. Okay? So, and then we'll wrap up with international finance, which affects net exports. Okay, so fiscal policy affects primarily businesses and consumer spending, government and consumer spending. Monetary policy primarily affects business spending. Net exports is going to be affected by international finance. So we're going to hit all 4 of those and how that affects the aggregate supply demand model. Okay, I'm sorry, starting to babble. I better let y'all go. Y'all have a wonderful day. Thanks, everyone.